IVM.
Hey everybody, welcome to another week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. As we go into God knows what week of the lockdown, we've been trying to make sure that we get as much content out to you as possible. We had some interesting episodes in the last week. Cyrus Says we had Angad Singh Ranyala on it. That was a fun episode to listen to. On the Filter Coffee podcast, we had Taslima Nasleen and Arunav Sinha on that. That was another great conversation. Karthik Srinivasan joined Varun on Advertising is Dead. And guys, look for Pratik Oswal on Paisa Vaisa podcast with Anupam Gupta. That was another great episode. I'd also like to let people know that the show that we're doing with Ms. Rashish Vidyarthi, Begin the Journey, is now going to be releasing 3 times a week. So do check that out. I'm sure you'll enjoy that. And let's get started with your show.
We are refugees here. People of a lost country, citizen to no nation. Tibetans, the world's sympathy stock. Serene monks and bubbly traditionalists, 1 lakh and several thousand odd, nicely mixed, steeped in various assimilating cultural hegemonies. Welcome to a new episode on States of Anarchy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan. Every fortnight, I speak to experts and scholars about global affairs and Indian foreign policy, all in the hope that we can make more sense of the world around us. What I just read out is a part of a poem by Tenzin Sundu called My Tibetanness. When we speak about Tibet and Tibetans, we often spiral into speaking about Sino-Indian relations and the border and geopolitics. But what if we take a step back and try to transcend national borders to look at Himalayan histories? What does that tell us about Indo-Tibetan relations before the 1950s? And how has the Tibetan exile community evolved in India today? My guest for today is an amazing person to sit down with. And I'm not just saying that because she was the first guest to bring me tiramisu for our recording. Swati Chawla is an assistant professor at the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. She's also finishing her PhD from the University of Virginia, where she studies nationalisms and citizenship claims directed against the Indian state from the Tibetan cultural region. We'll get to the conversation with Swati in a minute. But first, we take a short break.
Hi, I'm Sarayu Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Prasannakumar.
And we are the hosts of the Ganatantra podcast.
On this podcast, we speak to academics, social scientists, journalists, and activists to find out what's actually going on in Indian politics.
On this podcast, we stay away from personality politics, intrigue, and gossip, and instead focus on the data, research, and analysis that drives all this.
So tune in to the Ganatantra podcast, where new episodes are out every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Hi Swati, welcome to States of Anarchy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so you do a lot of research in a lot of different things. Can you tell us a little more about how you started, what exactly it is that you research on?
Yeah, well, when I was an undergrad student, I saw this poster that had a picture of the Dalai Lama on it, and it said Gurukul Spikmake, apply to spend a summer with the Tibetans in Dharamshala. So I applied, and that's how it got started. I spent a summer in a Tibetan Buddhist nunnery in a place called Sidhpur, close to Dharamshala, and I just got fascinated by the stories of the nuns, and I was a literature student at the time. So for my MPhil, I worked on Tibetan culture in exile. And then when the PhD work began, I was thinking about what discipline I wanted to go into. I knew literature wasn't quite the fit. I ended up in a history department, and then the work became a lot more archival, and I realized how much Sikkim and Bhutan were part of the Tibet story. So I think the different things you see they're still part of my BA, MA, and MPhil work on the nunneries with a literary studies perspective. And then the rest of it is archival on Sikkim and Bhutan.
Wow, that's amazing. Like, how was the nunnery? I imagine it to be sort of this profound coming of age experience.
It really is. One thing I still remember is, just imagine not looking into the mirror for over a month. They didn't have mirrors. which is a small thing, but it does something. Because we're so used to this, I look at myself in the mirror every morning and what I see is such a part of my identity. Like this morning I was thinking, oh, it's just a podcast, it's just my voice. I don't need to fix my hair or, how do I look? Or, that's a very small thing, but there are other things about it, of course, the discipline of monastic life. And you go into a nunnery and you think, and also because it was the experience of living in a Tibetan exile community. I had thought there would be stories of loss and dislocation, which is the story of exile. But there were also stories of opportunity, of what you can do now that you're out of Tibet and what you can do when you're rebuilding. And I think that's the story that inspired part of my MPhil work and then my MA in history. So I think it was a life-changing experience, and I think it's also good to sort of get out of your life and go and see what it is to subject yourself to that kind of regimen and discipline and austerity.
That sounds brilliant. It's also something we sort of share in common because my journey in international relations also began when I was sort of in the first year of journalism school and everyone could go intern somewhere. And I didn't want to go back to like my hometown in Chennai. So because, I was this rebellious like 18-year-old. And so I decided to go to Dharamshala and spend the summer working at a Tibetan newspaper there.
Wow.
And that sort of sparked my interest in China because I realized that I knew absolutely nothing about like what lay beyond the Himalayas because as someone who grows up in the south, for me the Himalayas were just like the end of the world in a sense, right?
Was that the Tibet Sun?
No, this was the Tibet Post.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it was a turning point for me and in just the way that I looked at the world and narratives and sort of the stories that we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump into it. We talk a lot about Tibetans in exile, particularly in India, because you have Dharamshala, which is a famous honeymooners spot now. And, you have like a cricket pitch near McLeodganj. So, but it wasn't always that way, right?
Yes.
And lots of times we go back to the Tibetans coming to India in 1959. But the story of Tibetans and the Himalayas and India goes back much before that. Could you tell us more about it?
Sure. That's a good question. Not everybody even knows that it doesn't begin in 1959. In fact, I teach a course now on Tibetans in India, and I start with, we all know that the Dalai Lama was exiled in 59, but so was his predecessor in Kalimpong in 1912. You wonder, like, what was the 13th Dalai Lama doing in British India? Why was he living in exile? And he actually lived in this place called Bhutan House in Kalimpong. So, there you have it. Kalimpong, Bengal, British India, Dalai Lama, Bhutan House. So what is this? So the families in Sikkim, Bhutan, and Tibet have been interconnected for centuries. At the cusp of independence, for example, in 1946-47, when India's figuring out, both the partition and the integration of the princely states, Sikkim and Bhutan are lobbying together with British India and saying that we don't want to join the Indian Union. Both states have treaties with the British Indian government. Tibet, of course, we know about the Young Husband expedition of 1903-04 and the importance of Tibet vis-a-vis the Great Game with Russia, but we often don't remember that Sikkim is the entry point into Tibet. And in 1890, the British stationed a political officer in Sikkim to keep an eye on events in Tibet and Bhutan too. So it's sort of, if we look at history in the first half of the 20th century in places like Kalimpong and Darjeeling, we now think of Dharamshala as this really cosmopolitan place. But so are these places. And these aristocratic families from all three regions are sending their kids to English schools in Darjeeling and in Kalimpong or in Calcutta. And the British are very aware of these interconnections. There's trade, intermarriage, monastic patronage. The Sikkimese prince, for example, is an incarnate Lama. He spends a lot of time in Lhasa. His first wife is from an aristocratic family in Tibet. So it's very much part of the Indian Himalayan story. You know, Tibet isn't, in these regions, is not a foreign country.
That's fascinating. Just as an aside, why was Tibet important vis-a-vis the Great Game in Russia, for those of us who don't know?
Sure. So the British were worried about what was happening, again, at the turn of the 20th century with, the Russian Empire expanding. And they were concerned that Russia was going to make inroads further east, and they wanted to safeguard their trade interests in Tibet. So there was a lot of trade between British India and Tibet, and Sikkim provided one of the passes into Tibet.
Okay. And so coming back a little bit to the Himalayas, the way you talk about the Himalayas is that it's sort of its own geographic region, right? I mean, if I think of the Himalayas today, I think of, Uttarakhand, but also Kashmir, Ladakh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, and it's this whole geographical feature. But I haven't thought of like Tibet on the other side, maybe Yunnan. How do you think of the Himalayas sort of just as a geographical region?
I think now with my research as more porous, again, growing up in North India, if we think about the very famous, the song we all sing in school, Sare Jahan Se Acha, and how they talk about the Himalayas. So, I'll just say it in Hindi and I could translate it, but Parvat wo sabse uncha, hamsaya asma ka, wo santari hamara, wo paspa hamara. So Himalayas as the sentry, as the barriers that protect us. So if we, and that's how often we think that, both in India and China, that, this is just something in the middle, and on this side is India, on the other side is Tibet and China. But for the populations that live in the Himalayas, it's not this experience of, there is this, it's not a border at all. It's very porous and people have been going back and forth. So just one day before the Dalai Lama reached India on 31st of March, 1959, just one day before that, Prime Minister Nehru was answering a question in the Indian Parliament about how many people from Leh, Ladakh were in Tibet at the time. And he said, well, they just come and go. They don't report to us. Throughout the 1950s, as India is consolidating its borders, there is recognition of this relative porosity of borders, of people, somebody just coming from Tibet to collect wood or to graze their animals. There is seasonal migration. So it's, I think my perception of the Himalayas has changed. So it's not this sort of, this side is this and on the other side is that. There's a lot of back and forth.
And you're saying even before British colonialism, there was sort of cultural continuity maybe between these Himalayan kingdoms?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
So, if you think about Ladakh, Sikkim, Bhutan and Tibet, there are interlinkages. So Buddhism, of course, provides one link. But trade, as I said, and intermarriage, monastic patronage. So you would have people, say living in Gangtok, who were giving tribute to a monastery in Lhasa or vice versa. So there wasn't this sense of, and people had multiple overlapping loyalties. So it wasn't as territorially demarcated or insulated as, we know our world to be, unfortunately.
So what changes with sort of British colonialism here and like maybe whatever is happening in China? How do world events around the 19th and 20th century change the Himalayas essentially?
So what happens, with the 1940s and then through the 1950s is there is a sense of these of borders tightening on both sides. So as the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is making inroads into Tibet through the 1950s, there is a growing anxiety in India, which is now, remember, a newly independent state. The partition has just happened, as to what, first of all, where the borders are, because the borders are not fixed and final. There is constant negotiation. So where are these borders? And also there's a lot of, both cartographic anxiety, but territorial anxiety of what is going to happen with the spread of communism. And if India can afford to be vigilant on all these fronts. So there's Pakistan on one side, and then there is, East Pakistan, and there's China. So both sides begin, and with the idea that China thinks how China envisages Tibet and Sikkim and Bhutan. And China is, of course, very critical of India's policy towards Sikkim and Bhutan. And they say that the era of protectorates is over. And why do we have this arrangement where India is looking after Sikkim's foreign relations and Bhutan's foreign relations? And India is concerned that China is going to claim Sikkim and Bhutan as part of their empire. So because of all of this, these areas that had relatively free migrations. Now, Tibetans could enter British India without a passport and vice versa. So all of this begins, changes in the 40s and the 50s. And there are these two big states in Asia asserting themselves, and borders become a part of that assertion.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Earlier in a podcast, I spoke to Deep Pal about how India treated Bhutan and Sikkim separately with different foreign policies. And that's why you see Sikkim eventually sort of annexed into the Indian Union. But that doesn't happen with Bhutan. And it continues to remain a sovereign state in the world today. But with the 1950s, when you have sort of the PLA making inroads into Tibet, even before the flight of the Dalai Lama, you see Tibetans crossing over in sort of droves, right? So what prompts that migration of people, and what happens when Tibetans sort of migrate? I'm guessing first into Nepal and then into India, because it is very hard, rugged terrain, right?
Yes, it's the most difficult escape route in the world, many would say. So what happens is Tibetans are concerned. So China makes several promises of Tibetans being able to retain their autonomy. So religious autonomy is a very large part of it. But Tibetans are very concerned that that's not how it's going to play out. And with increasing Chinese presence in Tibet, there is this fear of the loss of the Tibetan way of life. In 1956, India observed the 2500th birth anniversary of the Buddha. And their holinesses, the Dalai Lama and Panchen Lama, were both in India. And archival records say that even at that time, the Dalai Lama was very concerned with events in Tibet, and he said that he might want to stay on. And at that time, of course, he's persuaded to go back. But by the time 1959, things really have come to a boiling point. And Tibetans are concerned in March that he might be taken prisoner. And then he escapes to India, and he actually enters through this place near Tawang, which was an outpost of the Assam Rifles, and is now in Arunachal Pradesh. At that time was called the NEFA, and the Northeastern Frontier Agency. And Arunachal Pradesh still has a small percentage of Tibetan refugees. And from there on, he goes down to Assam and then to Mussoorie, and that's where he has his first meeting with Nehru. He's 23 at the time. We look at the Dalai Lama now, and it's hard to imagine. And Nehru is 69. Yeah.
Wow. So when Tibetans do cross over, what sort of challenges do they face? Do they, all of them, go to McLeodganj? When was the Tibetan government in exile allowed to set up there? How does all of that take place?
So gradually over a period of time, so 1959 is when the Dalai Lama comes in. We are now 60 years later. Around 120,000 Tibetans live in exile, out of which, according to the last census, about 94,000, I believe, are in India alone.
Okay, so and the remaining 30,000 are outside India?
Mostly in Nepal, but also, of course, in North America and Europe and elsewhere. But this was 2009 census, and now there are the latest figures. We don't have a comprehensive figure, but people would say fewer than 75,000 Tibetans because migration from Tibet has trickled down over a period of time. Nepal has tightened its borders. It's not letting as many Tibetans come in. Some have gone back as well. There has been reverse migration and many have gone abroad. So it's actually fewer today than 2009 from the time we have the last figures.
It's very interesting that the numbers have changed because I often wonder about sort of Tibetan citizenship, right? How these numbers are even formed. Are you taking people who consider themselves Tibetan by identity? Are these people who have managed to leave Tibet via China to emigrate elsewhere? Because a lot of times you don't have access to social services, particularly even in India, right? If you don't have citizenship, as we are now seeing with everything that is happening in the country today. So I can only imagine how it is for refugees who don't have the necessary papers.
Right.
So how does Tibetan citizenship work in that sense?
So that's a very good question. As some of your listeners might know, India is actually not a signatory to the 1951 United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees. So Tibetans are technically not refugees. They are registered as foreigners under the Foreigners Registration Act, the British Act of 1946, and subsequently the Registration of Foreigners Rules 1992. So what that means is that technically foreigners who are here for an extended period of time. Tibetans in India possess two documents which are relating to their identity / refugee status / citizenship. So one is the RC or the registration certificate that their local FRRO, which stands for, I believe, Foreigners Regional Registration Office. It gives them an RC. That up till 2012, I believe, had to be renewed every 6 months.
Oh my God.
And now every 5 years. So that's been relaxed a little bit. So that's one certificate that they get from the government of India, RC, and that's what they use in lieu of a passport when they travel abroad. In addition to that, the Central Tibetan Administration issues to all Tibetans in exile a green book, which is a common identity document for exiled population across the world. And this is, I mean, if we think about it, it's sort of this, how do you conceptualize a nation without a territory? So you could be a Tibetan in upstate New York or in Dharamsala or in Kathmandu, and you have this common green book. And that's how Tibetans in exile vote. And that's how they access the services of the exile government. So all the aid that is routed through the government in exile or the Central Tibetan Administration, as it's called. So the Green Book is this document that binds this population together.
That's really interesting because whenever I'm teaching sort of just like basic political theory for international relations, we talk about the difference between a nation, a state, a country, and a government, right? So what I always like asking people to think about is, can you have a nation and a state without a country? And then a lot of people can't arrive at that very quickly, but I think Tibet is a perfect example of that.
Yes.
Okay, so when Tibetans do cross over into India, do they first go to McLeodganj or Dharamshala? Are there like checkpoints or something where they are stopped? Like what awaits you if you're a Tibetan who's walking into Nepal and then into India?
So yes, they go to Dharamshala, typically have an audience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So now, you know, you might know that in Tibet, you can't have a picture of him. So for many Tibetans who are coming in, he looms large in their stories, because there's an affective connection that they feel towards him. So I was once talking to a monk in Kathmandu, and he was telling me that when he crossed over from Nepal, and then he went into Assam, and then he got on the train, and he asked somebody to buy him a ticket, and he said, all I knew was Punjab Dalai Lama. And he just kept saying every time someone asked him, he didn't know any Hindi, any English, he would just say Punjab Dalai Lama. And then he went up to Pathankot, and then from there got a bus. So they typically get an audience with him. And then they live like either in Dharamshala or one of the exiled settlements. But you were asking me earlier about the problems they face. Now, I mean, again, when I was doing my fieldwork in Bailakuppe, in Karnataka, which is the largest settlement, Karnataka has 5 Tibetan settlements, 2 in Bailakuppe alone. The weather, I mean, that's a problem. Initially, when Tibetans were coming in, there was overcrowding, cholera, measles. They could not take the weather or the food in the plains. And those that ended up in Karnataka, again, many would tell you the first generation refugees, they didn't know where they were going. And it was so far away from everything. And they have then managed to, set up a life for themselves and, create these settlements where I think credit goes to Nehru and to India for allowing Tibetans or giving them large areas of land where you could have a monastery and you could have a school and you could have an old people's home and preserve a little bit of Tibetan culture so they're not scattered, so that they could live together and have that. The monastery is such an important part of that life. So both monasteries and nunneries. So I think that's really laudable that they've been able to do that.
Yeah, when I think of Tibetans in India, I mean, primarily people think of McLeodganj and Dharamshala and Bailakuppe. Sometimes if you're from the south, you sort of hear of it. But there are Tibetans who live all across the country, right?
Yes.
Particularly in Assam, as you'd mentioned before.
Arunachal and Orissa, in Ladakh, Delhi, of course, Majnu Ka Tila is another, so they're spread across.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I was reading about sort of programs that were showing the Dalai Lama encouraging Tibetans living in Bailakuppe to take up farming. And it just seems sort of alien to me that at that point in time, that like when you think of Tibetans, you think of like nomads and herders to come down to like sort of the plains of Karnataka and to begin farming. But potentially just foreign crops, right? Must be difficult.
Yes, and I think it's also the other interesting thing that has happened, and this slice of it I got in the nunnery, just 200 nuns. This place was called Dolmaling Nunnery and Institute of Dialectics. It's the headquarters of the Tibetan Nuns Project. If you look at the map, Tibet is a very large space, right? So there is Kham, Amdo, and Utsang. And when I was learning Tibetan in the US, I was taught the Central Tibetan dialect. And when I would travel across, I remember in Kathmandu, I was trying to talk very broken Tibetan, and somebody said to me, "Why do you sound like a mid-century Central Tibetan aristocrat?" And I realized my teacher was a mid-century Central Tibetan aristocrat. And when I was speaking to somebody from Kham or Amdo, I couldn't understand a word of what they were saying. But what exile does is also these divisions become less important. So not all Tibetans were nomadic, of course. And Tibetan Buddhism, we associate Tibet with Buddhism, but there were Tibetan Muslims, for example, the Dalai Lama, when he goes to Ladakh. We've spoken about how there was the relationship between Ladakh and Tibet. And there are also those who are followers of the Bon religion. So some of these...
The Bon religion?
Which was the religion in Tibet before the advent of Buddhism.
Oh, wow.
So the Central Tibetan Administration has seats reserved for each of the 4 sects of Tibetan Buddhism.
Okay.
And for Bon. So it's all of these things that you would think may have divided Tibetans, or they might have had affiliations that I might have identified as someone from the Gelug sect or the Nima sect. But that becomes less important in exile. Just as Indians, when you travel abroad, it matters less if you're Gujarati or Punjabi or Kannadiga, you're Indian. So that Tibetan identity too, you were talking earlier about can a nation exist without territory? But I think what a nation existing without territory, there are some of these things that then you're like, wow, this hasn't existed in this way quite before. So Dolma-Ling, for example, was a non-sectarian nunnery. So there were nuns from all the 4 sects of Tibetan Buddhism studying together.
Wow.
Did that make sense, or did I just ramble?
No, it makes a lot of sense. And it's also something that got me wondering about whether the Tibetans who sort of leave Tibet, are they still able to keep in touch with family there? How do they sort of hear of news about what's happening at home? I know that earlier some people used to make the journey across and come back, not just once, but a couple of times. So what about the interchange in that sense?
So people are able to come back. Sometimes many have, so some of the nuns in Dolma-Ling, for example, would tell me that their families would visit India, say during the Kalachakra festival. So, that provided this one way for them to reunite, albeit very briefly, with their parents or cousins or brothers and sisters. Also, they're able to communicate now with WeChat, for example, is very popular, but there's always the fear of censorship and of conversations being intercepted and what you can and cannot say. So how free communication is, I guess, that we can't really say, but they are able to communicate, of course.
Okay, that's good. And earlier you'd also mentioned sort of this reverse migration where sort of Tibetans from India were going back. What would be sort of the reasons or the rationale for that?
Archival records, even in the 50s and 60s, show that, for example, on radio in Sikkim, there would be these broadcasts about China trying to encourage those who had crossed over to come back with promises of a job or of land or threats of what would happen to their families. So, so there was some of that that's always existed. But now, conditions within Tibet, many Tibetans that I would meet in the US, for example, would tell me of a greater opportunity now within Tibet, or also of Tibetans who wanted to work in China, in mainland China. So many are able to now say that, or are able to at least evaluate the pros and cons of living in India in exile versus going back, and perhaps are making that choice.
Yeah, I think it's always important to be able to have that choice at the end of the day. And when I think of sort of Tibetans, I wonder at what the generational change has done to Tibetan identity. Because if you're someone who's coming over in 1959 versus someone who was brought up in India without ever being to Tibet or knowing of it, how do you think Tibetan identity has changed?
I think it's very sad, when one reads, for example, in fiction, mostly in poetry, for example, of Tibetans who were born in India, who've never seen Tibet, and yet their parents have told them these stories. And of course, the first structures that Tibetans set up when they came to India, architecturally, if you see, very temporary structures, because there was this hope of a speedy return. And in the 80s, we begin to see more permanent structures and even setting up, if you see the Norbalinka Institute near Dharamshala or Dolma-Ling Nunnery, it looks like it's here to stay. So even building something that's more permanent is psychologically, emotionally, an admission of defeat. So for many who are born in India, my grandparents were partition refugees. And they would often tell me that they didn't think this was going to last. First of all, they didn't think they would have to move. Like in Punjabi, they would say that their father would say, Raje to aate jaate rehte hain. Like kings come and go. People don't move. Like that doesn't make sense. The British are leaving. Why do we have to move? And they also had this hope of return. But in their case, at least, they were moving into citizenship. But for the Tibetans, maintaining this refugee status or the status as foreigners or as a person who's in exile, meaning is actively working towards that speedy return, 3 generations down the line, it's difficult. And it's also, I think it's also to think of how remote sometimes Tibet seems for someone who's brought up in Delhi, for example, or in Dharamshala or in the US, versus how it would seem to their parents or their grandparents. And I think that's something all diasporic populations face. But here is one where, again, going back to what? So for somebody who's of Indian origin, brought up in the US, you can still come to India as a tourist, or your family is here. But Tibet has changed beyond recognition, and, the demographics have changed. So what is kept alive in the imagination perhaps no longer exists.
Whenever we think a lot about like diaspora and even with accounts of the partition, you can see that there's a lot of trauma in sort of leaving the land in which you were born, leaving your home. And there are lots of stories of partitions where people didn't take things with them when they crossed over because they were like, oh, this is a temporary thing and we'll go back. But there is a sort of profound sense of loss in the stories that come over. And I think with the partition, I'm a little glad to see that there's now more chronicling of oral histories. There are now people who are able to go back and visit homes in Pakistan just to sort of be able to reconcile themselves to that. How do you think these stories of loss not echo, but like how do you think they exist in narratives about Tibet?
That's a very good question. In fact, when I went to the nunnery, I thought, I don't know, I think also when you're an undergrad, maybe you have this, you're more confident. And as you sort of keep studying, you become less and less confident about what you knew. So I thought, my grandparents were partition refugees, all four of them. I've grown up on these stories, and that's exactly what the nuns must have gone through. And I know, what it is. I've heard of it. So my grandmother would say, for example, my dress was at the tailor's, or, so-and-so was going to get married, and we were all getting our clothes made, and we didn't even bother to collect them because we thought the wedding would be postponed and we would go back. So of course, with the partition, we are aware of these stories. But what I notice, and this is true even of the partition among some communities, is it's not just a story of loss. It's also a story of opportunity. So, for example, for Tibetan Buddhist nuns, exile became an opportunity. And how did it become an opportunity? If you were a nun in Tibet, nunneries were fewer, they were poorer, they were not as prestigious as monasteries. And when the monks came to India, they came in larger numbers. They came together. They traveled with their texts. Very often senior teachers traveled with the students. It was relatively easy for them to set up monastic institutions. But for the nuns, not so easy. They were fewer, they were more scattered, less confident. And it is in exile that they begin to assert themselves, and they begin to imagine what is it like to be a monastic woman in the present age. And we were doing this interview once with Rinchen Khandro Chogyal, who founded the Tibetan Nuns Project. She's actually the present Dalai Lama's sister-in-law. And she told us that, it became an opportunity to leave behind the rubbish of gender-based discrimination. So I think if we look at any experience of forced dislocation, we find stories of many different textures.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you've made, that it's important, just as important to look at the stories of opportunity as much as we do of the stories of loss. But just while coming back, with sort of the politics around Tibet changing and like policies between India and China changing and the relations of that changing, how does all of that sort of affect a Tibetan identity in a world where sometimes there's a talk of, oh, we're using the Tibet card, right? And it's a very sort of impersonal way of looking at people whose lives are impacted by this. And it's not just sort of some geopolitical move that you have, right? So how do you see sort of the Tibetan identity in the face of just uncertain political relations?
I think Tibetans have been able to portray and assert very well how the Tibetan question is not just about Tibet. So if we look at, just today or yesterday in the newspapers, the stories coming out of the Uyghur camps in China, and you see the Tibetan issue in the light of that. If you look at China's borderlands, not just Tibet, but Mongolia and Xinjiang, what's happening and what is the relationship that these spaces have to China proper. And the other is the Tibetan issue is also an ecological issue. It's about the roof of the world, and Tibet as the third pole or the Himalayas as the third. So I think they have been able to very skillfully show us that what is at stake here is not just the Tibetan people, it's the direction in which our world is going. And often now in 2020, when you talk about the Tibetan issue, when the elephant in the room is the issue of reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, he has said many times that there might not be a reincarnation, or he might be the last, or where would the reincarnation be, in Tibet or in India or elsewhere. But what is the relationship of the Dalai Lama to the Tibetan people in exile? What is the relationship of the people in exile to those who are in Tibet, who either chose or didn't choose but couldn't come into exile? So I think these questions remain as open today as ever, as they ever did. And with the Doklam standoff a couple of years ago, I think what it also reminds us of is, the Doklam Tri-Junction, we thought of the standoff mostly in bilateral terms as it's a Sino-Indian thing. But it's not. The Tri-Junction is Bhutan, Sikkim and Tibet. So there it takes you back to that history in the 1940s and 50s to what was happening to these borders. And if we forget that history, we lose that perspective. And it's not just Sino-Indian relations, right? That they are informed by all of these other histories. So the Tibetan issue also reminds us of that.
Yeah, that's, I think, a very important point because, particularly people who I work with, when we're talking about China, we think of China and India and the modern state system because, in the modern state system, your state is your primary actor. But I think we easily forget the histories of how these borders evolved and the fact that they continuously evolve. And the people still living around there continuously reconcile themselves with what is happening. So how do you feel when you're teaching Tibetan history, when you're talking about Tibetan identity? I understand you teach in India and the United States.
Yes. And first to the question of borders, my students do a map project on ArcGIS story maps where they look at how in the last 150 years they can pick any one region in South Asia and they show through 3 historical maps how the borders of that region have changed. I think we shed so much blood over borders as if, they're final and that's how they have always been. So I think a sense of history and just looking at maps and seeing, well, these borders were made by human actors and they are negotiated and fought over and redrawn, perhaps would make us a little humble. So I think Tibetan history is one way, just looking at the history of the Himalayan region is one way perhaps inculcating that humility. And one of my students wrote in the course evaluation that, this was in the US, I was teaching at the University of Virginia on modern South Asia. And that was the time when there was this very high-pitched conversation on the border wall with Mexico. And he said, I realized that borders don't come as facsimiles from heaven. I think that became, to me, also this reminder, when you think of a nation, we think of the map.
Yeah.
And we think of the borders, and we can't think of nations without borders. So that's one. On the question of teaching about Tibetans in India, now I'm at the School of Liberal Arts and Humanities at Jindal Global University in Sonipat. And we are among the few, or maybe the only university that's offering a course on Tibetans in India at the undergraduate level. And it's interesting to ask students what would make you register for a course like this. As an undergrad, there are all these courses on offer. And of course, many are interested in knowing about Buddhism, or they've been to Majnu Ka Tila and they want to know about that. But I start the course with talking about Ladakh, Sikkim, and Bhutan. And that surprises students. And they're all Indian students. So I think it's also a way to decenter Indian history, which we think about as very North India centric, or we think about in modern Indian history, independence and partition as being the two big events. But looking at the history of India through these regions, again, I think is a way in inculcating a little more intellectual humility, or just humility in general, that, how is quote unquote India perceived among these neighboring states. And again, one of my students is an international relations student, and he was telling me that he never thought about the histories of these regions independent of Sino-Indian relations. So exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, I think this is fascinating because we think of the history, particularly if you read sort of like a 10th standard Indian history book, we think of Indian history as sort of this linear story, right? Like of this list of names of first you had the Guptas, then you had these people, then you had these kingdoms and these, and then you had the Mughal invasions, and then it changed, and so on and so forth. But the interesting thing for me is when you move away from that narrative and you read about regional stories, when you read particularly about borderlands, where all of this breaks down, is that you have this new set of narratives, right? And this is not true just for one place in India or the other, but someone from the south, like one of the first episodes that we did on this podcast was with Sunil Amrit, who was talking about like using the Bay of Bengal as its own sort of region, right? And that's why this is very interesting, that you can look at the Himalayas as having their own history, and you can do that with India's borders on the east, where you still have tribes that are contiguous on borders with Myanmar. And just the way the borders have evolved in our national consciousness. When you were talking about Sare Jahan Se Acha, even our national anthem lists a bunch of geographical features that we sort of feel proud of and you think of as being essentially Indian, right? But it's not always been so.
Yes. In fact, I was in the archives reading these documents from the Indian citizenship section of the Home Ministry of Tibetans who applied for Indian citizenship, Tibetans who came in before 59. And you sort of, if you look at what makes this person apply for Indian citizenship and how he's telling his story to the authorities, so there's this person who would say, well, I was born in Lhasa and then I went to Peking for studies. And then I came to Darjeeling and I had a carpet business. And then I became a monk. So I, either went back to Lhasa or I was at a monastery somewhere in Bengal. Then I went to Nagpur to study Sanskrit. And one of the questions they want to ask in any application for citizenship is, where are you from? And they want a one-word answer to that question. And this person says, well, I'm here, 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 here. And there is such a suspicion of itinerancy. And there is such a discomfort with people who move. So, they move across the lay monastic binary, which we think is a binary, but in the Tibetan case and many communities actually in South Asia, it's not a binary. You could be a monk or a nun for some time, and then you could live a lay life. You could go back. It's more fluid. Or, you could be living in different places, or this person, and then they want him to produce a certificate it's called the renunciation certificate. It's one of the requirements for citizenship. So you have to say, produce a certificate from a competent authority of the country whose citizenship you are renouncing. Now, Tibet, after it no longer exists independent of China, there is no competent Tibetan authority in India that can give them a certificate. So the Indian authorities say, well, go to the Chinese consul in Calcutta and get a certificate. And this person says, but I fled the Chinese. I am not a Chinese national. How can I renounce my Chinese citizenship? So what we think of, so two things emerge from these stories. One is that what we think of as borders are not imagined as borders by everybody. So when someone is coming from Lhasa to Gangtok, or is going from Gangtok to Thimphu and then to Kalimpong and Darjeeling, there is an imagination of the Tibetan cultural region. There is a cartography that doesn't map very neatly with the borders that we see today. That is one. And the second is that people also think of their identities as more fluid. So I had this example where this person said, when I left monastic life and when I left Tibet for 5 years, that automatically means I have given up all claims to Tibetan citizenship. That's his argument. So I should not be made to renounce it again. And so there is this language of this affective language that is very different from the bureaucratic language of the Indian state, which is asking him for one place of origin, for one nationality, for a renunciation certificate. So I think some of these stories, also remind us that the violence of both constructing and administering borders, it's not just on the borders, but it's also on how we really don't understand how people live their lives and how they travel and marry and patronize monastic institutions and trade. All of that is lost when we look for checkboxed identities.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who move a lot of the diasporic community has pointed out sort of the lack of language to describe where you're from, right? So it's very easy to say, oh, I'm from the South, and that's sort of the identity that you have. But it doesn't take into account sort of the richness of your life and the experiences that you've led. And it's not accurate to sort of box yourself into one of these things, because obviously people, when they think of you, they want to just place you in their own mental image of how the world looks like. And citizenship is the easiest way to do that. Oh, you're Indian, you're Tibetan, you're Chinese. But for a lot of people who move around and live around the world, I think they have a very difficult time just sort of reconciling themselves to fitting them into one box.
Right.
So it also reminds me of how with citizenship, bureaucracy is painful, right? And I'm guessing you must have gone through this in the archives.
Yes.
I'd love to hear more about it, because now when we're talking sort of about the Citizenship Amendment Bill and so on in India, and you have to sort of show papers, but where would you go for these papers? For your parents, forget for yourself. And bureaucracy is always painful, and that pain is the punishment that you're facing for no reason, in my opinion. But what do you think of it when you look at sort of Himalayan citizenships?
So, again, going back to just the citizenship section archives, when the debates around the CAA were happening, I would sometimes get nightmares because I'd spent so much time looking at this archive and really the violence of bureaucracy with the best of intentions, thinking of what people go through. So I think one thing to notice, and this is just me making a plea for everyone should go to the archives and spend a few weeks there just for fun. One thing you notice is, not just what's typed, what's formally there, but the notes on the margins. So how the bureaucrat reading someone's case, how is he processing their case? So in the cases of Tibetan applicants, this sort of shorthand emerges where they want to ascertain quickly if this person is Buddhist or communist.
Okay.
And they become like two sort of polar opposites. So if somebody is learning Sanskrit, then of course they're Buddhist. If somebody is rumored to be a spy, or if it's a woman who is rumored to have had many lovers, she's obviously a communist spy. Now, I am generalizing, I'm being a little facetious, but it's sort of that, you read this person's case who's telling you, I was here, and then I was here, and then I was here, I was a monk for part of the time, or then I was a trader, and now I want to live and serve in India. To reduce the complexity of that life story into, does this person belong or does this person not belong? Are they a threat or are they an asset? I mean, that's the judgment that you're making when you're sitting in the Home Ministry on that file. And what is enabling you to make that judgment? So what kind of assumptions do you have? And of course, 1962 happens, the Sino-Indian War has happened, there's the threat of communism. So all of that, you wouldn't, it's not clear, but it's clear if you read enough of these and you say, okay, this person is consuming the newspapers and is having conversations. And a lot of that is going into how they make this decision. And it's not about, whether they are good or bad people. But how can you make a decision? And so some of these checkboxes, this paperwork, I mean, there's this one person whose case I was writing about yesterday. I was revising a dissertation chapter where it goes on for close to 20 years. And he's arguing again and again that he can't produce a renunciation certificate. And again they ask him for, if you can't produce this, then do you have this and do you have that? And, he's saying, well, I came to India without any papers, without a passport. I have been living here for 20 years. Here is where I work. I know Sanskrit, Tibetan, Hindi. He's employed at Shanti Niketan as faculty. And all of that is not sufficient for him to prove that he belongs. He's married to a person from Sikkim. He has a child. And he says, I have no other affiliation. I have no other place I can go to. This has been my home for 2 decades. So again, I mean, the violence of putting somebody through that kind of test. There are also, and I think that's something that came up in the light of the CAA debates, Indian nationals, quote unquote, Indian nationals who are registered as foreigners erroneously. And then they have to argue that they belong. So I found this case of a man from Darjeeling who's from the Bhotia tribe. And when the census officials are going around, he's not at home and his neighbors say he's a dealer in Tibetan curios and he's a Bhotia. And they write him down as a Tibetan. And they call him to the foreigners registration office with his papers. And he says, what are you talking about? I was born in India. And again, his case goes on for years and years. And this man keeps pleading, I have never been Tibetan. I have never been to Tibet. I have lived here all my life. I was born here. My parents were born here. At one point, they say, because we can't accept you as an Indian national, the nationality of your father, who's long deceased, also cannot be written as Indian. So the father is posthumously denied his citizenship. So sometimes it's bizarre. But you say, I mean, you have these rules and these rules look very neat and people's lives are messy. And in between the two, even with the best of intentions, this is what happens.
There's something that I hear often in sort of public policy is the saying that good intentions don't make for good policy, right? And so, and I understand that when you're a bureaucrat and you're dealing with all kinds of cases, that you need sort of like an SOP, right? Like a standard operating procedure. But the idea of are you communist or are you Buddhist almost sounds like some warped reality show or like you're left swiping on a dating app or something like that. And I think it's also painful because it goes back to your sense of belonging, to what is home and who you are. And these are very, very difficult and traumatic questions, particularly if you're living along borders and if you're just trying to lead a good life and be a good citizen, whatever that means. And I can understand why so many people opposing the Citizenship Amendment Bill do. And I wonder, does the Citizenship Amendment Act, does it change anything for the Tibetans staying in India?
It doesn't, because it doesn't include the Tibetans, right? So it just includes Afghanistan, Bangladesh and Pakistan. So that the Tibetans are not within the ambit. And in fact, one of the criticisms of the bill was, and I had also written about this, is if we are thinking about India's neighborhood and those that are fleeing religious persecution, then what are the grounds for leaving out Tibetans who are also fleeing persecution on religious grounds? And the Sri Lankan Tamils, for example, is the other example that's given.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point of note when we're talking about, particularly when you compare how the Citizenship Amendment Act is supposed to help people, particularly what it is doing is sort of reliving some of the stories that we have back in the 50s when we first had to deal with these questions of citizenship, and throws back a lot of the stories of loss that we spoke about. So I can see why it would be traumatic for many people. Just coming back to Tibet, what books or resources would you recommend for someone who's interested in reading more about Tibetans, about Himalayan identity, or anything? Please tell us.
So this book came out recently, Berenice Couillot-Richards. It's called Shadow States, India, China and the Himalayas, 1910 to 1962. So it's a magisterial monograph for the first half of the 20th century. My favorite book on exile is by Keela Dyle. It's called Echoes from Dharamshala, Music in the Life of a Tibetan Refugee Community. She's an anthropologist and she is listening on the streets of Dharamshala. All the different languages that you hear and the songs. And so that's my favorite for exile. Another book I would recommend is it's a monograph on Sikkim, and it's not really about the contemporary period, but I think it informed a lot of my work. It's by Saul Mullard. It's called Opening the Hidden Land, State Formation and Construction of Sikkimese History. Okay. That looks at how Sikkim as a nation was constructed, and what is the Tibetan connection there. And finally, my mentor Indrani Chatterjee, her book, and the title is very telling. It's called Forgotten Friends, because some of these stories really are stories of forgotten friendships, forgotten friends, monks' marriages, and memories of Northeast India. Those would be my 4 picks.
All right. That sounds great. I really look forward to adding them to my reading list and to start reading them as soon as possible. Thank you so much, Swati. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us. I've attached some resources for you in the episode description, so do check those out. Swati also curates a set of stories under the hashtag Himalayan Histories, which are great insights into the dynamics of the Himalayas. I would highly recommend following her on Twitter, where her handle is @ChablaSwati. If you, like me, are struggling with your productivity because of the lockdown, remember to breathe and take time off work. Then you can use this time to listen to podcasts and brush up on your foreign policy knowledge. One way is to check out the Takshashila Institution's courses on public policy. They're mostly online and are of varying lengths depending on your interests. So go check them out at www.takshashila.org.in. If you have any comments or questions, you can reach out to me at HumsniH on Twitter and at States of Anarchy on Instagram. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM podcast app, but also on Spotify, iTunes, Castbox, Ghana, and wherever you're listening to this podcast. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.
Beta, did you know 79% of all scientists in NASA are Indian only?
देखो, इंडिया में टैक्स सिर्फ मिडिल क्लास भरती है. Everyone is just enjoying free यार.
आजकल के youngsters are only interested in partying and enjoying. उनको देश की पड़ी ही नहीं है.
बेटा तुम बस शादी कर लो, उसके बाद तो you can enjoy life like anything.
I will tell you what this country needs. This country needs 15 years of dictatorship. That is the only way to become a superpower. See the Chinese, how much they've progressed.
सुनो, तुमने ये WhatsApp forward देखा?
So what's common between all of these statements?
They're all absolutely rubbish.
Fake WhatsApp forwards that spread like wildfire.
And statements that defy any logic.
We are here to debunk them all.
Way of family WhatsApp groups, worst nightmare. Where what happens when you read a book.
Basically, we're just a bunch of guys who want to cut through the bullshit of everyone saying this, how it won't be true.
So that the next time someone confidently squeezes out some WhatsApp or Twitter BS, you can look them dead in the eye and go, Uncle, please sit.
So join me, Joel.
And me, Tushar.
Every Mondays for a fresh new episode of Uncle, Please Sit.